By the month of May 1792, Sydney Cove was no longer only a hungry camp. It was a colony pushing outward, with muskets behind new claims. Land grants west of the harbour became fenced farms, and Prospect, beyond Parramatta, marked the edge where forest met plough. For Aboriginal families whose paths, hunting grounds and sacred places lay there, the new lines cut into country like wounds, not boundaries. Prospect was not one village. It was ridges, creeks, and clearings where people moved with seasons and ceremony, gathering and travelling by custom. The newcomers read the same ground as property, measured allotments, timber, pasture, and tracks for carts and patrols. Each new hut pulled more cattle and corn behind it, and each animal ate into the food sources the original owners depended on, tightening the pressure day by day. In colonial paperwork, frontier violence was condensed into blunt labels: raid, attack, disturbance, and then a short report. Behind those words sat a chain of cause and effect building since first contact. Spears met muskets, hunger met confiscation, and fear met punitive patrols. By 1792, the pattern was established. Expansion created scarcity, scarcity created resistance, and resistance triggered retaliation that widened the conflict and hardened attitudes on both sides. Accounts point to a sudden strike near Prospect, a fast blow at farms and stock, planned to hurt and vanish before soldiers could form a line, leaving smoke and silence. That is why raid fits better than battle. The aim was not to hold ground under gunfire, but to signal that the frontier was not empty. The settlers were not untouchable, and the cost of occupation would keep rising if the push continued. Within that resistance, one name appears repeatedly: Pemulwuy, spoken with fear in some huts. To officials, he became the face of defiance, a man they wanted captured or killed. To many Aboriginal people, he was a strategist and war leader. His authority came from reputation, courage, knowledge of country, and the ability to unite groups for coordinated action when survival demanded it, rather than from any colonial office or title. The colonists drew power from a system, paperwork, and armed escort. Governors issued land, controlled rations, assigned convict labor, and ordered armed parties. A fence was not only a farmer's choice, it was backed by law and muskets. That backing mattered because the administration feared that every successful raid would invite more resistance and make settlement beyond Parramatta appear impossible. So responses tended to be swift, demonstrative, and severe. To picture the Prospect raid, imagine a cold dawn. Mist in low ground, bark huts and crude barns, animals shifting in pens, and men with axes more than weapons, half awake. A raiding party could emerge from scrub, drive off cattle, damage stores, and disappear into bush before a musket volley could be organised. Movement and local knowledge were the advantage, and they kept the frontier in constant alarm. The aftermath mattered as much as the strike. Farmers demanded protection. Officials worried about confidence and rumours after raids. Soldiers were sent along tracks clear on paper but confusing on the ground. Patrols hunted footprints, questioned intermediaries, and sometimes punished the wrong people, deepening anger. Every expedition risked ambush and exhaustion, yet doing nothing risked looking weak. In that tension, frontier policy tightened into routine coercion. For Aboriginal communities, the raid was one scene in a longer war for home, carried out under relentless pressure. The targets, cattle, maize, tools, were also symbols of an economy replacing theirs. Taking stock could feed families, but it also hit the settlement's ability to expand. Destroying stores was a tactic against supply, not random cruelty. In the logic of resistance, the message was simple: stop building here or expect losses. Part 1 ends where both sides misread the other's resolve, and the frontier darkens. The administration treated raids as crime to be crushed, believing force would restore order. Resisting groups treated each strike as proof that settlement could be checked, believing pressure might slow fences and herds. Between Prospect and Sydney, the distance was a short journey. Yet politically, it was vast, and across that divide Pemulwuy's legend began to harden into history. After the Prospect raid in the month of May 1792, the colony's leadership faced a problem larger than stolen stock. The strike suggested coordination, confidence, and a widening frontier war. In Sydney and Parramatta, the talk was not only about the loss itself, but about what it meant. That farms beyond the first ring of settlement were vulnerable, and that fear could spread faster than any dispatch rider. Officials saw the danger of panic and the political danger of hesitation. The colonial system answered such moments with structure. Orders moved from the governor's circle through magistrates, officers, and constables to small detachments. Patrols were assembled, sometimes including soldiers and sometimes armed settlers, and they marched along the rough tracks toward Prospect. Their purpose was described as protection and punishment at once: guard the farms, recover animals, and demonstrate that attack would bring consequences. That dual purpose made restraint difficult. On the ground, the frontier was not a clear line. Farms sat like islands in bush, and the bush belonged to people who could disappear into it. A patrol could reach a hut after hours of marching and find only frightened faces and rumors: who was seen, which direction, how many men, how many spears. Witnesses often disagreed, and many were traumatized. The administration relied on these testimonies, yet they were shaped by fear and by the limited knowledge of settlers who did not read the landscape the way local groups did. For Aboriginal fighters, the ability to choose when and where to strike was the core advantage. Raids did not require holding a fort. They required timing, secrecy, and escape routes. Prospect's terrain, wooded ridges, open patches, creeks, made that possible. A raiding party could hit a target, vanish, and watch as armed men arrived too late, exhausting themselves in pursuit. Each failed pursuit added to the aura of resistance leadership and to the frustration of the garrison. Pemulwuy's name grew in this climate because the colony needed a person to embody what felt like a spreading threat. Colonial papers and later recollections tend to focus on him because he appeared at multiple flashpoints and because he was spoken of as a unifying figure. This focus can oversimplify a complex network of kinship groups and alliances. Yet it also reflects how leadership can emerge under invasion. Someone becomes the organizer who can bring people together for a shared aim. The settlers, meanwhile, experienced the frontier as a daily gamble. A farm's survival depended on a harvest, on keeping animals alive, and on the morale of convicts assigned to labor. Rumors of raids could empty fields and delay work because men refused to go far from huts. The psychological effect therefore multiplied the material one. In that way, a raid could be more powerful than its immediate damage. It could slow expansion by making the countryside feel unsafe. Colonial responses often slid toward collective punishment. When officials could not identify attackers with certainty, they targeted areas or groups perceived as hostile. This approach, common in frontier settings, deepened resentment and broadened conflict. Families who had not taken part could be driven off, assaulted, or threatened, and then they had new reasons to resist. The violence did not remain a single incident at Prospect. It became a cycle in which fear justified force, and force produced more fear. At the same time, the colony's dependence on supplies made it sensitive. Sydney still relied on fragile logistics, and farms like those near Prospect were vital to feeding the settlement. Cattle and crops were not luxuries, they were the difference between stability and hunger. That meant the administration treated attacks on farms as strategic threats, not petty crime. This is another reason the Prospect episode sits at the start of a series. Once food production was targeted, the colony's nerves tightened. From the Aboriginal perspective, the frontier was already violent before any raid. The arrival of fences and herds meant displacement, the destruction of yam grounds and grasslands, and the disruption of hunting patterns. When settlers fired on people for approaching their stock, or when patrols entered camps, that was experienced as an attack on life itself. Resistance, therefore, had moral weight. It was defense of country, and the targets were the machinery of occupation. By the end of this second part, the stage is set for escalation. The colonial system responds with more patrols, harsher orders, and a belief that a decisive capture will restore control. Pemulwuy and those around him respond with the lesson that raids can hurt and survive, and that the colony's confidence is fragile. Prospect becomes more than a place west of Sydney. It becomes a symbol of a frontier where two worlds collide, and neither can pretend the other will simply vanish. As the year 1792 moved beyond the month of May, the Prospect raid did not stand alone. It became part of a rhythm of frontier conflict that both sides learned to anticipate. The colony's expansion had momentum, driven by land grants, convict labour, and the need to secure food supplies. Aboriginal resistance developed its own momentum, driven by survival and by the accumulating injuries of dispossession. In that contest, each action was read as precedent, and precedent hardened into policy. The administration's first instinct was to impose certainty on an uncertain landscape. Patrol routes were extended, sentries posted, and farms urged to arm themselves. Yet the more the colony militarized the frontier, the more it signaled that it expected further fighting. That expectation shaped settler behavior. Men began to travel in groups, carry muskets to the fields, and build more defensible huts. Defense became part of everyday life, which also meant tension became permanent. For resisting groups, permanence of tension also meant planning. A raid at Prospect demonstrated that the settlement's outer ring could be struck, and that those who struck could slip away. The next step in such a pattern is repetition with variation. Shift targets, change times, and strike where the enemy is least prepared. This method does not require large numbers at a single point. It requires small groups coordinated by a leader or by shared understanding. Colonial references to Pemulwuy often place him at the center of that coordination. Pemulwuy's influence, as described in colonial records, was not only about physical bravery. It was about knowing how to fight a stronger armed opponent without offering him the kind of confrontation he wanted. Muskets and cannon favored open ground and set-piece engagements. Spears, clubs, and mobility favored ambush, hit and run, and the use of bush as cover. The Prospect raid aligns with that logic. It was not a failed attempt at formal battle. It was a conscious choice of method. The colonists' system powerfully shaped outcomes because it could replace losses. A cow killed could be replaced from a herd. A hut burned could be rebuilt with convict labor. Patrols could be sent again and again. Aboriginal losses were harder to replace because families were smaller. Resources were tied to specific places, and displacement could break social and economic networks. That imbalance often pushed resistance into tactics designed to raise the cost of occupation without exposing communities to annihilation. Colonial fear turned Pemulwuy into a symbol, and symbols are dangerous because they simplify. If one man is blamed for all raids, the administration will believe that capturing him ends the problem. That belief can drive relentless pursuit and severe punishments. At the same time, for many Aboriginal people, a symbol can unify, making resistance feel shared and meaningful. Thus, the same name could intensify both pursuit and support, accelerating the conflict by concentrating attention. In the farms near Prospect, everyday scenes carried the edge of war. A man leading cattle to water watched the tree line. A woman guarding stores listened for footsteps. Convicts, many of them unwilling workers, feared both the bush and the punishments of supervisors. In that climate, misunderstandings could ignite violence. A movement in scrub could be treated as a threat. A person approaching a farm could be shot at. A patrol could enter a camp and trigger retaliation. The frontier produced its own logic of escalation. Communication across cultures was fragile. Some individuals moved between worlds as interpreters and intermediaries, but trust was thin. Settlers often interpreted resistance as criminal theft, while Aboriginal people interpreted settlement as theft of land and life. When the colony's officials spoke of punitive actions, they imagined restoring order. When Aboriginal families saw armed men entering country, they saw invasion continuing. Without shared legal ground, each side treated its own actions as justified and the others as barbaric. The strategic importance of Prospect lay in its geography and its symbolism. It was close enough to Sydney to matter, and far enough to mark expansion. Attacks there suggested that even near the heart of the colony, control was contested. That shook confidence and invited more resources to be poured into the frontier. In this way, a raid could shape policy, not by defeating an army, but by forcing the state to act as if it faced an army. Part 3 closes with a frontier locked into a cycle. The colony responds with more armed presence, more land allocation, and more insistence on its authority. Resistance responds with further raids, the use of terrain, and the consolidation of leadership around figures such as Pemulwuy. The Prospect episode becomes a lens through which later conflicts are understood, a warning that expansion would not be peaceful, and a sign that the first people of the region were willing to fight for their country, even when the odds were brutally unequal. By the time the frontier settled into the months and seasons, after May 1792, the Prospect raid was being absorbed into the colony's institutional memory. It became a reference point in reports, conversations, and decisions, proof that farms west of Sydney required protection, and proof that Aboriginal resistance could be organised. In this phase, the conflict increasingly became bureaucratic as well as violent, because the administration attempted to translate fear into rules, orders, and routine operations. The colony's power as a system lay in its ability to normalize coercion. Land distribution continued, and each grant brought a new household, new fences, and more stock. At the same time, magistrates and officers expanded the patterns of armed response. Patrols became expected, and punitive expeditions were framed as necessary maintenance of order. Once a practice becomes routine, it becomes harder to question, and it also becomes easier to escalate. A patrol that finds nothing today may return tomorrow with sharper orders and fewer restraints. For Aboriginal communities, routine coercion meant routine threat. Movement through country could be interrupted by armed parties, camps could be approached or broken up, Individuals could be seized or attacked. Even when a patrol did not kill, it could destroy food stores or force people away from water and shelter. That pressure pushed more people toward the logic of resistance. If peace meant slow starvation and constant humiliation, then a raid that risked death could still appear as the less destructive choice. Pemulwuy's role in this period is best understood as both practical and symbolic. Practically, leadership in a raiding conflict requires organizing meetings, choosing targets, and maintaining cohesion across groups that have their own obligations and rivalries. Symbolically, his continued survival and appearance in colonial narratives reinforced a message that resistance was not a single outburst, but an ongoing campaign. Colonial officials tried to frame him as a criminal, but the repeated mention of his name also inadvertently acknowledged him as a war leader. The settlers' lived experience shifted from surprise to expectation. Early raids shock, later raids shape behavior. Farms became more defensive, and people spoke of the bush as a hostile space, even though it was the original home of the region's first inhabitants. This transformation of perception mattered. When settlers see the landscape as enemy territory, they are more likely to accept harsh measures. When Aboriginal people see patrols as permanent invaders, they are more likely to support raids. Each perception made compromise less likely. The prospect area itself represented a frontier of food. The colony needed grain and stock, the farms needed labor, the administration needed stability. That hunger for stability created pressure to suppress resistance quickly. Yet suppression was difficult because the geography rewarded those who knew it best. Even armed men could march for hours and find nothing, while a small resisting group could observe them, wait, and strike elsewhere. In such conditions, the state often turns to intimidation. Show strength, punish suspects, and hope fear does the work that intelligence cannot. But intimidation has costs. It can generate short-term quiet by driving people away, yet it can also produce long-term hatred and more determined retaliation. The Prospect Raid had already demonstrated that resistance could accept risk and still act. That suggests that fear alone would not end it. Instead, the conflict moved toward a grim form of mutual learning. Settlers learned to fortify and patrol. Resisting groups learned which targets mattered most and how quickly soldiers could respond. The frontier became a place of tactics rather than dialogue. In colonial discourse, the line between defense and retaliation blurred. A settler party might claim it was protecting property while chasing people into bush. An official might claim it was restoring peace while ordering violence. This blurring is typical of frontier war, and it explains why modern historians often speak of resistance and punitive expeditions rather than formal battles. Prospect was one of the early moments when the colony and its opponents began behaving as if they were in a war without declaring one. The human costs were carried by those with least power. Convicts were compelled to labor in exposed farms and could be punished for refusing. Aboriginal families faced displacement and death, and the loss of country that could not be replaced. Settler households lived in anxiety, and some individuals responded with extreme cruelty. The administration, focused on control, often measured success by whether farms stayed occupied, not by whether peace was just. In that sense, Prospect marks the moral fracture line. Expansion demanded enforcement, and enforcement demanded violence. Part 4 ends with the Prospect Raid receding into a larger narrative of the Hawkesbury and Western frontier conflicts, where Pemulwuy's resistance would be remembered as a turning point. The colony's system continued to expand because it could mobilize law and force together. Aboriginal resistance continued because it was tied to land, identity, and survival. The raid's meaning therefore deepened over time, not as a single incident to be solved, but as an early chapter in a long struggle over who had the right to live, farm, and belong on that country. To understand the Prospect Raid of May 1792 as documentary history, the final step is to measure what it changed. It did not end settlement, and it did not remove Aboriginal people from their country. Instead, it revealed the true character of the Western frontier, a struggle over land that the colony preferred to describe as policing, but that operated like war. From that moment, expansion west of Sydney carried a permanent expectation of resistance, and resistance carried a permanent expectation of retaliation. Prospect mattered because it forced the colony to admit, even if only in internal thinking, that the landscape was contested. When a farm is attacked, a governor can treat it as crime. When raids repeat, the state treats it as security. Security thinking reshapes policy. More patrols, more weapons, stronger legal claims, and harsher punishment. Those choices, in turn, shape the frontier's future by making violence normal. A raid that starts as a tactical strike ends up reorganizing an entire border zone around fear. Pemulwuy's repeated appearance in colonial accounts after this period shows how resistance leadership becomes central to narrative. The colony needed a name to target, and the name became a symbol of the war it did not want to name. But the documentary truth is that one man cannot create a frontier conflict alone. His influence depended on networks of kinship, shared grievance, and the practical knowledge of many fighters and families who supported them. The Prospect Raid sits within that wider web, where leadership amplifies existing determination rather than inventing it. For Aboriginal communities, the raid's meaning was immediate and existential. It was a statement that dispossession would be contested, and that new fences would not automatically erase older law. Even if the raid did not stop farms from being built, it asserted continuity. The country still had owners, still had defenders, still had memory. Documentary storytelling must hold that truth alongside the colonists' fear, because fear without context becomes propaganda. Context reveals that the root cause was invasion and appropriation, not spontaneous hostility. For settlers, the raid accelerated a sense of the frontier as dangerous. That sense was not entirely imagined. People were attacked and property was destroyed. Yet documentary history asks why such danger existed. It existed because the colony moved into country without consent, and because the state treated Aboriginal presence as an obstacle rather than as a political reality requiring negotiation. When settlement expands by force, it produces counterforce. The Prospect Raid is the frontier's grammar made visible. The colonial system's strength, its law-backed violence, also became its trap. Because officials could allocate land and send armed parties, they could keep expanding. But expansion increased conflict. Each punitive expedition could create new enemies. Each new grant could displace more families. In the end, the system could win territory, yet it could not easily win peace, because peace requires legitimacy. That is why episodes like Prospect echo through later decades. They are early signals that control and justice are not the same. Documentary narration must also acknowledge the asymmetry of records. Much of what we know comes from colonial documents, reports, letters, and later recollections. Aboriginal oral histories exist, but many were disrupted by violence and displacement and were not written down at the time. This imbalance does not make colonial records false. but it makes them incomplete and biased toward the concerns of property and order. A careful documentary uses those records to trace events while recognizing what they leave out: voices, motives, and losses that were not valued by the writers. In practical terms, the Prospect raid helped shape the colony's frontier strategy. Protect key farms, patrol likely routes, and pursue leaders. It also helped shape resistance strategy, strike selectively, use terrain, and target the economic engine of expansion. These opposing lessons fed into the broader Hawkesbury and Western Sydney conflicts that followed. The raid was therefore both a symptom and a teacher, accelerating a conflict that might otherwise have unfolded more slowly, but could not have been avoided under the same conditions. The human reality beneath strategy is the most important documentary conclusion. The raid was not a mythic clash of good and evil. It was the collision of two societies, one backed by imperial power and one defending home. Lives were altered in a single morning at Prospect. Fear entered households, grief entered families, and the land itself became a battlefield of meanings. When a fence goes up, it changes more than a field. It changes relationships, languages, and futures. Prospect shows that clearly. So the final lesson of May 1792 is not only about Pemulwuy or about colonial patrols. It is about the beginning of a frontier war whose logic was set by dispossession. The colony called it security. Aboriginal people lived it as invasion. Documentary history, at its best, holds both realities and refuses to smooth them into a simple tale. Prospect was an early warning that the west of Sydney would not be taken quietly, and that the cost of taking it would be paid for generations.